Question is that the bill be now read a second time. Mr. Saktiandi, Supaat.
Mr. Speaker, sir, this bill is an important milestone in our journey to become greener as a country. As recently as 2020, transport accounted for 16% of Singapore's carbon emissions. This is already a lower percentage than the US, UK, and the global figure, but it is still a significant piece as we look to cut our carbon emissions. Introducing this framework to regulate safe and efficient charging of EVs is a significant starting step, but it should not be the end. My speech will not only focus on clarifying how certain provisions in this bill is going to operate, but also discuss the broader implications on our strategy to transition Singapore's vehicle population from ICE to EVs. First, I support Part 8 of the bill, which requires developers undertaking certain building works or electrical works to install infrastructure to support the supply of minimum electrical charging capacity, as Minister has shared earlier. This helps to future-proof developments that are presently being constructed, even as a national EV strategy is being considered and refined. It is generally more cost-effective to plan and incorporate such infrastructural elements at the outset than to require costly variation works midway through the construction works. However, when is this Part 8 going to come into force? And would present developments that have already obtained preliminary design and construction approvals be required to modify their plans? Another question I have is, what is the minimum stage that the planning and construction work has to reach before the Minister would consider exempting a development from the new requirements introduced by Part 8? Further, is there a particular reason why the new Part 8 requirements will not apply to works carried out by the government or any public authority on land that they own? Given the nationwide push for a greener transport infrastructure, I would have thought that the government would join the effort and take the lead in equipping its developments with the necessary electrical infrastructure. Second, the large part of the bill serves to regulate the devices that are intended for charging EVs in Singapore, the operators of charging stations and the providers of charging services for EVs. As we are contemplating the widespread use of EVs and EV chargers, it is key that we have a regulatory framework to ensure the safety and efficient deployment of EV chargers. From my reading of the bill, I understand there to be 3 levels of regulatory control. First, EV chargers must be approved by the Land Transport Authority, LTA, as an approved model, then affixed with an approved label before it can be supplied or used in Singapore. Second, EV chargers must be registered with LTA and specify a registered responsible person before it can be used to charge any EV in Singapore. Third, persons who provide EV charging services in Singapore or engages in conduct as a charging station operator must be licensed. Are each of the 3 levels of control necessary, or is it regulatory overkill? We must be cognizant that each level increases the amount of compliance costs for EV charging operators, or EVCOs, which could have the effect of increased EV charging costs for end users, and even the effect of squeezing out potentially competitive EVCOs from the relatively small market we have in Singapore. In the longer term, this is all going to have a material impact on the cost of EV charging, which I feel will make or break our efforts to get Singaporeans on board with our vision to transit to EVs. I would like to ask the Ministry if there is a fair valuation exercise built in for the EV charging over the next 5 to 10 years. While EV and charger companies can do their part to manage costs, the full package of government policies, taxes, and fees ultimately play a major impact to the lifetime cost competitiveness of EV versus ICE vehicles. It will be useful to have a sense of the extent of the fair value of EV charging costs in the future at this juncture. In relation to the first level of control, the LTA will only approve an EV charger model if it is satisfied that the model meets the safety and performance standards prescribed by the regulations. A question I have is, have these regulations been prepared and are they ready to be put into effect immediately? And what are all these safety and performance standards that will be built into the legislation? It is also contemplated that LTA-approved models of EV chargers will be identified with an approved label that is affixed to each EV charger which is intended to be supplied, installed, certified or charged with in Singapore. what is the applicable fee that will be prescribed for the issuance of an approved label? That would be useful to note. Further, what is the applicable fee for the issuance of an additional label where the LTA approves a proposed alteration or modification to the EV charger model? Another question is the approved label really the most suitable enforcement mechanism? Not only are physical labels susceptible to wear and tear, which may cause them to peel off the EV charger, more importantly, who is the intended audience of the label? For the regulator, the presence or absence of a label is unnecessary for it to identify whether an EV charger is an approved model. For an end user, I'm doubtful that the absence of a label would cause them to avoid using a particular EV charging station. The second level of control is for the LTA to register an EV charger if the EV charger is lawfully certified as fit for charging any EV in Singapore and lawfully installed in accordance with Clause 24 of the bill. Given that a certifier is obliged to check that an EV charger satisfies the applicable safety and performance standards here, does it not render the first approved label stage superfluous? Why is it necessary to separate the approval of EV model and registration of EV chargers into two stages? Clauses 23 and 24 of the bill provides that the certification will have to be done by a prescribed competent person and a prescribed person. We now know from LTA's announcement that this refers to a charger equipment specialist and a licensed electrical worker or LEW respectively. Are there any plans by the Ministry or LTA to train and recruit more Singaporeans to be LEWs and charger equipment specialists? Are there any targeted numbers of such specialists to support our EV charging push? While there may already be ITE and polytechnic courses and programs in this regard, can we aim to do more, for example, by designing career conversion programs or career transition programs around these aims to meet our requirements? The bill also requires the registered responsible person for an EV charger to keep and retain records such as certificates going back at least 2 years. Given the overarching theme of sustainability in relation to this bill, my humble suggestion is that such records can be uploaded and kept in a centralized electronic repository rather than in paper form. This will be in line with our general push to digitalize our systems and records. This would also assist the LTA in transposing the necessary information to the register of registered for charging EV chargers that is required to maintain. I also have a couple of questions on the register to be maintained by the LTA. First, what are the concerns that drive the confidentiality provision at Clause 22(4) of the bill? I note from the public consultation feedback that the key concern is over undue disclosure of commercially sensitive data by the EV charging companies. What commercially sensitive information is the LTA register expected to contain? Second, Clause 35 requires a manufacturer or supplier of an EV charger who becomes aware of any safety-related defect in the EV charger to give notice to every registered responsible person for charging EV charger of the same model, among others. How would a manufacturer or supplier go about obtaining such confidential information? Finally, on the third level of control, that is licensing of service providers and operators, as a preliminary question, what is the expected duration for which licenses will be valid? Will the conditions of renewal be spelled out clearly in subsidiary legislation? I ask these questions because I expect an FCO to have to invest significant capital expenditure or CAPEX at the outset, which can only be recouped by its provision of services over time. It will be important for them to have enough certainty over their projected revenue stream in the mid to long term so as to perform their internal financial calculations for their business. Also, considering our targets for EV population and the number of EV charging points, as mentioned by Minister earlier, does the Ministry have a rough idea of how many licensees it intends to allow to operate in the geographically limited market here? I recognize that there are potentially a number of operational issues that LTA will need to formulate in consultation with the industry, such as what the optimal license conditions ought to be. Considering the importance of this area in the next 10 to 20 years as we work to phase out petrol and diesel vehicles by 2040, there may be value in encouraging a professional body to bring the relevant stakeholders and actors together. I believe the licensing regime introduced under the Insolvency, Restructuring and Dissolution Act of 2018 was implemented quite smoothly, in part because there already existed professional bodies like the Insolvency Practitioners Association of Singapore, IPAS, that was anchoring the professional development and standards in that space. Third, Part 4 of the bill specially empowers the government to make rules to trial non-approved or non-registered EV chargers. I assume they will automatically apply to the existing regulatory sandboxes that are taking place. On that note, may I ask if there are any interim findings from the ongoing regulatory sandboxes for battery swapping for electric motorcycles? I had previously asked the PQ on this back in October, and I think earlier as well. I note that the bill is technically broad enough to cover battery swapping services. Can I confirm that notwithstanding the Ministry's position that the charging of detachable batteries at home remains disallowed, it is prepared to proceed to register and license battery charge and swap stations, or BCSS, while the regulatory sandboxes are ongoing? Fourth, can I check if the LTA intends to take a proactive and preemptive enforcement stance instead of prosecuting persons only after a particular safety or other incident has occurred? How does the LTA intend to do so beyond mandating for periodic inspections of registered EV chargers, which will not flush out cases of unauthorized supply or modification of EV chargers? Also, what are the enforcement capabilities and resources needed by LTA in the future, and if it will meet the rise in enforcement needs? Mr. Speaker, sir, I would like to conclude by sharing some thoughts on matters that do not appear to be expressly dealt with in this bill, but which should be considered as part of our holistic plan to transition towards an electric vehicle population. One, would this bill and its subsidiary legislation, if passed, regulate the commercial aspects of how EVCOs conduct its business? For example, by imposing ceilings on charging costs or mechanisms to regulate any increase in charging costs. Given that the road tax for an EV is significantly higher, how the EV charging costs compare to the cost of petrol will be key in determining consumer take-up. Some assurances or controls over future increases in EV charging costs will give some consumers the confidence to take the leap of faith and go with the relatively new EV option. Two, LTA's power to order a step-in arrangement under Part 7 of the bill is a useful power, but the LTA's role in encouraging a vibrant and competitive EVCO sector is equally, if not more important. HDB and JTC are likely to be the largest landlords with which EVCOs will contract with in Singapore, and such tenders are usually conducted by the LTA. When EVCO has its license suspended, revoked or surrendered, instead of externalizing the costs to taxpayers by ordering a step-in, a vibrant and competitive EVCO sector would mean that market forces can be counted on to secure a replacement EVCO for continuity of services. Having regard to the large tenders which have already gone out this year, what are the LTA's optimal long-term plans in terms of the number of EV charging points, percentage of HDB car parks that are EV charging lots, and others? Three, are there any plans to develop this legislation in future to go beyond regulating the EV chargers and become an omnibus act that will cover all aspects of our EV transition? Mr. Speaker, sir, while EV and charger companies can do their part to manage costs, the full package of government policies, taxes and fees ultimately play a major impact to the lifetime cost competitiveness of EV versus ICE. MOT and LTA will have to dynamically continue to manage the relative calibration of all the components to meet Singapore's overall goals and ensure safety at the same time. Notwithstanding the clarification sought, I support the bill. Thank you.